Okay, I'm going to talk to y'all about fluoroscopy, and this is just continuing on with chapter 38 in the textbook. Here's the objectives that I identified. We want to be able to illustrate the parts of an analog fluoroscopic image intensifier. So we'll need to be able to kind of draw those out. We'll talk about this process of image intensification, how it works, piece by piece, how this process works. We'll talk about flux gain, and we'll be able to calculate what flux gain is. We'll talk about brightness gain. We'll talk about the benefits and limitations of using magnification when we're working with a fluoro machine. We'll look at the different coupling systems. We'll talk about quality control. And then we'll compare and contrast digital versus analog fluoroscopy and illustrate the parts of a digital fluoroscope. There's a lot of your facilities, even if they're fully digital with all of their other imaging, there still is plenty of analog fluoroscopy that's out there because it's very easy to just change the coupling mechanism and you can still get a digitally stored image. Fluoroscopy was also the first time that we started using PACS in the X-ray department for storage of images and things like that, just because it is more or less digital in nature. It's less film based. So these are the basic parts of an image intensifier tube. I wanted to include this graphic in here because it's not necessarily included in your textbook. It has a picture on page 677, but I like this one just a little bit better. So there's basically, like the textbook mentions, there are 5 basic parts to a fluoroscope. There's an input phosphor, right? I'm going to zoom in on this. There's an input phosphor. There is a photocathode, right behind the input phosphor. Then there is a series of electrostatic lenses that push the electrons towards a focal point. And this accelerating anode towards which the electrons are being attracted. And finally, there's an output phosphor. So what we're doing is we're converting, the X-rays are coming into the fluoroscope here. They're hitting this input phosphor, and the input phosphor is glowing. It's giving off light. The X-rays hit the phosphor, and they glow, right? Then this photocathode picks up the light and turns that into electrons, right? Turns the light into electrons. Those electrons are then accelerated towards this anode. Very similar to what's happening inside of an X-ray tube, right? We have the production of electrons, they're accelerated towards an anode. In this case, they're not going to strike the anode. Instead, they're going to strike the output phosphor. But what's interesting is they're upside down. So there's a lot of interesting stuff here that we can ask questions about. Like, this is really rich territory because it works very similar to an X-ray tube. It also works very similar to the human eye, right? Because how does the human eye work? We have a lens. It flips the light upside down in order to focus it on a bundle of nerves towards the back of the eye, right? So the eye does the exact same thing. A fluoroscope in some ways is modeled off of the human eye and the X-ray tube stuck together, right? So a unique device in that regard. So again, I'll run through that one more time. Input phosphor produces light. This is an abundant area for test questions. Input phosphor produces light. Photocathode produces electrons in response to light. They're focused by the electrostatic lenses towards the anode, and then the output, they strike this output phosphor and produce light again, right? So X-rays produce light, light produced electrons, electrons produce light again.
Can you do that one more time?
Yeah. You bet. And it is also available online, so let me pause this. So here is the exact same thing kind of stepped through in recipe form, step by step. So rather than an image, this is it written out. So an input phosphorus, a lot of times it's made out of cesium iodide. It receives the radiation, the remnant beam exiting the patient. Receives the remnant beam exiting the patient, and it emits light photons in response. So photons strike it, it gives off light. Then we have a photocathode. It receives the light, right, and emits electrons. Then we have a series of electrostatic lenses that focus the electrons. They're negatively charged, so they're pushing the electrons towards that focal point, towards that fulcrum, right? Then they, the one thing missing here, of course, is the anode, that they're being accelerated towards an anode, right? They pass by the anode. They don't strike the anode. Instead, they strike this output phosphor, right? So it receives those electrons from the photocathode, and it emits a lot more light than what we initially had. Roughly 50 to 75 times the amount of light that was received initially from the input phosphor exits the output phosphor. So the purpose of this is to increase the brightness, the signal that we're receiving from the patient. We're doing a number of things to do that, right? A number of geometrical processes are going on. The first that we should consider is what we call flux gain. Okay? Flux is a fancy word for an amount of photons, right? It could be an amount of X-ray photons, an amount of light photons, any amount of electromagnetic radiation physicists will refer to as flux. I think largely because that's what electromagnetic does. It's constantly in a state of flux, right? It's just the flow of electrons or energy. So we have got a gain that we're exploiting within the fluoroscopic tube. Since we are accelerating those electrons toward a central point and decreasing the area that they're striking, we're basically bundling up the electrons. We're increasing the amount of photons that are striking the output phosphor. We're increasing that signal. And he talks about this on page 678. So the way that we can calculate this is simply you take the number of output light photons that are emitted by the output phosphor, and you divide that by the amount that struck the input phosphor. And that will give you how much flux was increased, right? Brightness gain is just to continue on from there. So now we're going to add one more geometrical factor in here. We will get the flux gain, and then we'll multiply it by what we call the minification gain, right? So in reducing the area that the photons, the electrons are striking that output phosphor, we have increased the brightness, right? By reducing the area, we've increased the brightness. A very simple way to think about this is to go back to that lab where that impromptu lab where we had flashlights on our phone, right? And we held the flashlights close to the desktop. When it was closer, the area was smaller, but the flashlight was much brighter, right? If we pull it back, the area gets larger, but the light is not as bright. That's exactly how brightness gain works. It needs, the smaller it gets, the brighter things get. The smaller it gets, the brighter things get. I'm not necessarily interested in you calculating brightness gain, right? Not necessarily interested in that. I want you to understand what this concept is, right? That it is the result of the way the fluoroscopic tube works to basically increase the amount of flux and decrease the size. That will be the way that will increase the brightness. So the X-ray, the fluoroscopic tube is designed to do just that. And that ties directly to how fluoroscopes can be used to magnify area of interest. Okay? So this is on page 678, 679 in our textbook. The way that we mess with the magnification of the X-ray image on a fluoroscope is we change what we call the field of view. This is page 678, the field of view. I'll draw this up here. Okay, so before we talk about this magnification mode and how it works, we first need to understand a little bit about how the fluoroscope functions. So I'm going to draw a terrible picture of the fluoroscope. So what we're doing is we are changing the area of the field of view, which is this area from here to here. Field of view. We're going to reduce it down in order to magnify the image. When this occurs, right, if you put on your thinking caps with me, if I shrink this field of view down, I will cause the image to become magnified. By shrinking the field of view down, I will cause the image to be magnified. But I also just shrink the area of the input phosphor. So what will we expect is happening in terms of brightness and things like that? If I shrink the area of the input phosphor, what happened to the brightness? No, it actually reduces. If I shrink the area of that input phosphor, there's no longer as many X-rays striking the phosphor, so it's not giving off as much light. For it to give off light, it has to get hit by an X-ray. So if I say, okay, I don't want this whole area to be sampling, I want just that. Since I shrunk the area of the field of view, it's given off less light. And that doesn't sound so bad until you remember, oh, wait a minute, there's that automatic brightness control. Right? So the minute I just reduce the amount of light, the feedback circuit says, pump up the juice, right? Give the patient a higher MA. So by increasing the magnification, I did get better resolution, better spatial resolution, better contrast resolution. I'm not going to define what those terms mean right now. Just know it gets me prettier pictures, right? In all regards, prettier pictures, but at the expense of an increased patient dose. At the expense of an increased patient dose. So, the way that magnification works is we reduce the area of the input phosphor where we are receiving information. We shrink it. We make it smaller. So we're receiving less X-rays striking that input phosphor. So less light is being given off over a smaller area. But what we've also managed to do is increase the size of what we're seeing, right? Because we made this size that much more closer to this size of this output phosphor. So if you notice, one of the things that's happened is we've had a shift in our focal point, right? We've had a shift in the focal point. And so that has caused us to zoom in, right, with where the patient's at. Now, if all of this is not making a lot of sense to you, it's okay. It's okay. We're going to talk about this again. But the important thing to remember here is that with magnification mode, you're going to see less, but what you do see will be in better detail. But the patient will get fried. All right? You remember those three things, and you're golden. No one is going to make you calculate where a fulcrum is or anything like that. You do not necessarily need to know what these focal points are, anything like that. It differs so much from machine to machine, it's irrelevant. The principle is what's important.
So I have a question.
So there is no. I don't want to make this more complicated than it needs to be.
It's gonna be complicated.
Okay, this is traditional analog fluoroscopy still. I'm still talking about output phosphors and input phosphors. In this case, what we've got is a VidCom. This is a television connection. There's a camera, a television camera, that we stick to the back of an analog fluoroscope. All it is doing is scanning the visible light and making it into an electrical signal, right? That's how TV cameras work. They scan visible light and turn it into a signal. That's all you need to know about that. It's using a television camera. to connect. We could also use fiber optics, which is still basically the same thing, only now we added some lenses to it, right? Now we've got the camera. We can use fiber optic cables. We're just looking at what's the fiber optics doing, right? Most of this stuff is pretty dated, right? This is not necessarily where things are at, but you should just know, I don't want people to get confused if they see a question about lenses or fiber optics. I don't ask y'all any questions about it, but you should just know that there's a number of different ways we can connect these things together. The significant thing here is this charge couple device, right? Charged couple device. Bookmark that because we will come back to it. But what it is it's a way of receiving information based solely on the transmission of charge. Receiving information based solely on transmission of charge. So charge couple devices are helpful, and we use them in a number of other ways besides fluoroscopy. This is probably the most dated slide on this slideshow, but if you notice, old school television tubes, this is an old school television glass picture tube. Guess what? It's got an electron gun and an anode, right? So in the world of fluoroscopy, what we just did was we started with an X-ray tube, cathode and anode, produced electrons, accelerated them towards an anode, produced X-rays. The X-rays went through the patient, struck the anode, struck the input phosphor, produced electrons. Those were accelerated towards an output phosphor, right? To look at that, we just fed it back into an X-ray tube, right? Where we've got an electron gun and an anode. Only now what we're producing is a light signal. So old school televisions, like old school tube televisions, produce X-rays. They're actually allowed by the government to produce X amount of X-rays. Right? In fact, there's an old Simpsons episode where Grandpa Simpson's thinking back in the good old days, how he had like the Radium 500 TV set. He's sitting in front of the TV set. He's being X-rayed, right? So that was true. That was the case, right? The TVs that we use now, the computer screens that we use now, don't use that technology anymore. Okay, but this is more of a historical fact. So as you can imagine, what we've got going on here is a number of safety considerations, right? As we're thinking about how best to use this thing, we need to be thinking about how best to use it safely. And the big takeaway here, right? This isn't in your textbook. I've just given you this information here. We need to make sure that our fluoroscopes are working properly every year, and some of these things have changed some. So normal, the ESE means entrance skin exposure, right? For a normal fluoroscope, it should be less than or equal to 10 Rankins per minute.
What does it stand for?
Rankin.
Entrance.
Entrance skin exposure.
Entrance?
Entrance skin exposure.
Oh, okay.
Entrance skin exposure. So for normal fluoro, it should not be higher than this. And these numbers have changed, so we'll revisit them. But for right now, just know that for normal fluoro, it shouldn't be higher than 10 Rankins per minute. The other thing to understand is, remember, this automatic brightness control is your friend. It's making sure that the pictures maintain their the appropriate brightness level. But we have to evaluate it annually, because if it's out of sync with the unit, it could wind up inadvertently overexposing the patient. All right, now we're switching gears slightly, and we're going to talk about that conventional analog fluoroscopy versus where most of us are at now with this digital. So we've had a slower rollout of digital fluoroscopy than we did digital X-ray. So even though your system or your hospital may be fully digital in terms of all their X-ray, they may still have an analog fluoroscope that you're using, right? That is quite often the case. The big thing that's pushing the change is the reduced X-ray exposure required to do digital, right? So you can notice it's roughly half what conventional requires for 5 minutes of fluoro. So if there's one thing we need to understand, digital has significantly less dose. Digital has significantly less dose than fluoroscopy. And the reason for that goes back to the charge couple device. That if you remember all of the things that we were having to do to get a fluoroscopic image, right? We had to convert X-rays to light, and then light to electrons, and electrons back to light, and then the light has to be sampled by something, and all that stuff, and then it has to be scanned out to to a television or whatever. All of that, every time when we do one of those conversions, we're losing some of our signal, we're losing some of our information. Something's being lost in translation, right? With a charge couple device, there's really just one conversion. Light from an image intensifier to a signal, period, you're done, right? If you're wondering where you have these magical devices, they're on your cell phone. The camera that you have on your cell phone is a charge couple device, right? We all know how great these cameras are that are on their phones, right? They're wonderful. Versus like when I had to take pictures, you know, back when I was your age or whatever, it was an incredibly painful process to take someone's picture, right? So now we just go from light to from the image intensifier directly to the computer that is presenting the image, right? Since there's less translations, less information is being lost, right? Less translations, less information is being lost. Okay? That's all we need to know about charge couple devices right now. We will get into the nitty-gritty of how these devices work and what's happening here, but that won't be until the last trimester that you're in the program. It is helpful to know what are the advantages of these things since we're using them so much, right? Since we are primarily digital now. They're going to have an increased spatial resolution, right? In the world of fluoroscopy, they have a better spatial resolution. In the world of general radiography, they do not. Film had a better spatial resolution. But just speaking about the world of fluoroscopy, they have a high signal to noise ratio. That means they get more signal and less noise. They get more signal and less noise. They have a high detective quantum efficiency. That means that they can do the translation more readily. That detective quantum efficiency just means that less is being lost because they're efficient in the way that they do the translation, right? They do not require a warm-up. There's no lag or blooming, which we used to see a lot when we turned on fluoroscopes. And if you're working on an older system, you'll know it immediately because the first picture that you take, it's going to like bloom into life. It's going to come out really bright, and then all of a sudden it resolves into an image, right? So it was pretty bright. If you're trying to work with a patient and you get this kind of strobe of bright light, it was very distracting. We don't have that with digital systems. We don't have spatial distortion. The maintenance is reduced, and they say that the life is longer, right? And especially if you're looking at something like a tube television or something like that, those things had definite half-lives to them. And the big takeaway here is lower patient dose. All of that stuff adds up to decreased patient dose. Better pictures, decreased patient dose. So definitely digital has won the day. So in terms of the image display, right? How we actually look at the picture at the end of, after we've processed it, and we're presenting it to the physician or to ourselves. We have two basic methods. We have a conventional fluoro system with a signal to noise ratio of 200 in the signal, 1 to the noise. Over here, we're using a progressive model, which is, if you're wondering what progressive is, I don't know if you've ever been watching the news and there's like a computer on in the background and you see that kind of flickering image of the monitor as it's progressively scanning information across the computer screen. That's a progressive mode of scan. It's happening quicker than our eye can perceive it, but every single one of your computer monitors are progressively scanning out information. You just can't see it. It's happening that fast. So it uses that progressive mode, and you'll notice the signal to noise ratio is significantly higher. You don't need to memorize these numbers. These are not things to memorize. You just need to be able to compare and contrast. This one's better, this one stinks, right? if we can make that case, if I can make that case forceful enough, guess what? This one goes off the board, and we don't have to talk about, for training for the registry, we don't have to talk about input phosphorus, output phosphorus, and all that garbage. We can just talk about digital, right? So that's why all that information is there.